Wait.
Oh, yeah, it says meeting is now streaming live on YouTube. Cool.
It's setting it up, so not yet, but.
Yeah, well, it says on here.
Okay, it's live.
Okay, cool. So I'm starting the share. Good luck, everybody. See you in 3 minutes.
ירתנו בוערת כולה, ברוחות שחורות תסערו, להבות חורבן יבערו, עקבותיה לא נשארו, היא עולה באש, ואתם חובקים ידיים בלי הושיט עזרה, בלי כבות את אש הלהב, אש העיירה. שריפה, אחים שריפה, קרובה חס וחלילה השעה, כי הלהבות יתמידו, כולנו בו ישמידו, רק שרידי קירות יעידו מה שפה היה, ואתם חובקים ידיים בלי הושיט עזרה, בלי כבות את אש הלהב, אש העיירה. אחים שריפה, רק בידכם בלבד היא העזרה, חיש הושיטו יד אוהבת והצילו מהמוות, בדמכם כבו שלהבת, חיש כבו בדם, מרחוק אל תעמודו כי האש עולה, אל נא תחבקו ידיים, השרפה גדולה.
Good morning, everybody. Hi, Jacob. Thank you all for joining us once again on our virtual tours around the world. Today, we're heading to Ukraine, and I'm honored to welcome back our tour guide for today, Jacob Shushan. Born in Jerusalem, Jacob is a licensed tour guide in Israel, as well as a teacher and lecturer at the Tour Guide College in Israel. Jacob is also a senior tour director and lecturer for the Geographical Society in Israel. Jacob has visited 98 countries and led tours in 65 of them on all 6 continents. Jacob is fluent in 15 languages. He's present in deep discussions on Jewish history, philosophy, and culture, and is deeply involved in Holocaust education. We are so glad to have you here with us today. Please send your questions to us via the chat, and we'll address them at the end of the tour. So Jacob, you can take it from here.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Nice to see some familiar faces whom I've seen in our previous meeting. I'd like to wish everybody an interesting time with us, not always easy, but it will definitely be a little different. So you see the map, you see where we are going. right on the eastern part of Europe. We're still in Europe, we're not in Asia yet. And this is the map of the country we're going to visit today. Many of you would trace their ancestry. Your parents or grandparents might have told you they came from Russia. Like we said to those of you who were with us the last time we met when we toured the Baltics, also here, that was a very, very large Jewish population that didn't declare themselves to having come from Ukraine, because at that time, Ukraine did not exist. Everything was part of the big Tsar Empire, the big Russian realm, and many of the Jews who moved to the New World originated from these towns, from these areas. It has to do with the topic that you know, many of you, by now, the Pale of Settlement. For the longest time, Jews were restricted. They couldn't live where they wanted. They were told where they can live, and that's where they had to set shop, and that's where they had to exist. Some of them managed somehow to find refuge or sneak into other locations, but most of the millions of Jews who lived in what was then the Tsar Empire, the Russian Empire, lived within these boundaries, the Pale of Settlement. When we talk about the Jewish population of Ukraine, we have to take into consideration the many changing borders. Many of you might have heard from your parents or grandparents. They went to sleep with one kingdom, they woke up to another empire, the next day it was another republic. And the truth is that when we look at the heart and center of Ukraine, that is Podolia, but it included Galicia. When you talk about, you know, the jokes about the Galicianers, the ones who put sugar in the gefilte fish and so on, most of Galicia was actually in Ukraine and not so much in Poland. Ukraine today is an independent country. As you can see, they've celebrated their independence some 30 years ago after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. It's a huge country with a huge population. Please look at the number of the Jews. Before the war, almost 2.5 million. Over 1,200,000 were killed during the Holocaust. Today is a very viable, very active, very vibrant Jewish population there. They are very influential, always were, and even a few years ago, it was an unusual situation where the president of Ukraine was Jewish, the prime minister was Jewish, and the head of the opposition was Jewish. So everybody at the helm, if you want, was Jewish. We mention Ukraine as the birthplace of one of the most significant revolutions in the history of the Jewish people. It's fairly recent. We can talk about three major revolutions. First of all, the Hasidic movement, which was born here, and then the Communist Revolution, and concurrently the Zionist Revolution. Unfortunately, there was also the calamity of the Holocaust. So Ukraine is the birthplace of the Hasidic movement, an event that has changed forever the life and structure of the Jewish people all over the world. As I like to do, I like to take you on an actual tour. We'll see the modern places and remind ourselves of the past. So we'd like to start in Kiev, travel through Ukraine, and end up in Odessa on the shores of the Black Sea by way of many important Jewish centers. Today, Kiev, the capital, an important city, 3 million people call it home. It's a beautiful city with both traditional old architecture as well as lots of Stalinist style architecture, which was done when they rebuilt the city after World War II, with lots and lots of very modern architecture. We'll talk about the history in a minute, but I'd like to take you now on a short visit of some of the most beautiful subway stations. They have an incredible subway system through the city, and the stations are so ornate, so beautifully decorated. It's like a museum to go from one station to the other with the murals and the paintings on the ceilings. And it's absolutely a wonderful experience. Makes a whole difference of riding the public transportation, as well as walking the streets. Some of the housing projects and some of the older buildings that were not too nice to look at are getting more than a facelift with these beautiful murals that artists are commissioned to paint on the building. So again, walking in the street is also like walking into an art gallery. The slide is not upside down, the lady is, the building stands upright. And they have a very whimsy sense of humor in their art. I love the outdoor art which they have, even this bench. I think it's so creative, it's so fantastic. Unfortunately, it's not all beautiful. Jews have lived in this country at least from the 13th century. The earliest commemoration in a town that we'll visit later on in Lvov is 1256. But something terrible has happened here when this gentleman, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, went on a riot, went on an uprising against the then king. His troops took big time action against whoever they did not like, and they didn't like anybody who was not like them. So they've killed thousands of Catholics, thousands of different other small minorities that live there from Tatars and Muslims, but a big disaster happened to the Jews. Tens of thousands of Jews were slaughtered out in public during the time when they roamed through this part of the world. Unfortunately, the disaster did not stop with that killing. That disaster made people so desperate, they jumped like crazy at the chance of Mashiach is coming. A false Messiah showed up, Shabtai Tzvi, and he presented himself as the Messiah. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were so excited, and they have converted to whatever new craziness that he has introduced. He himself was captured by the Turkish Sultan. He had either to be killed, he can choose, or to convert to Islam, and he did. Guess what? We lost hundreds of we lost a significant part of our people because of that amazing situation where so many people followed this false Messiah. He is now a national hero, this Bogdan Khmelnytsky. His statues and his memorials are all over the place. In the 20th century, there was another big disaster when the Soviet Empire was just being founded and people were fighting to grab a seat in whatever new entities will be created after the collapse of the Tsar Empire. This gentleman, a nationalist, encouraged these people, and they went, we are now in the 1910s, 1920s. They go and they kill thousands of Jews in these areas. Actually, he had to flee. He ended up in Paris. That's where he found his death, as we'll find for a minute. He is still considered, Petliura is still considered a national hero. Look at that. The president of Ukraine visiting Paris met to lay a wreath on the tomb of Petliura. We like to mention that there was this young Jewish gentleman who lost his family because of the Petliura uprising and the Petliura pogroms, if you want, and he followed him, he located him in Paris, and in 1926, he shot him, and he immediately went to the police and turned himself in. He said, I've just killed a murderer. He was set on trial, he was found innocent, he was released, and he became now a hero for us. In Israel, we name many streets and squares and so on after this gentleman who avenged the death of these thousands of Jews by the Petliura gangs. Another important person who hails from this place is Shalom Alejand, maybe the most outstanding Jewish writer at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. He ended his life and he worked in New York. That's where he moved. And he is probably one of the most fantastic writers in the Yiddish language. He is commemorated here in Kiev. There is a museum where we can see how period furniture looked like at the time. A statue stands outside, but look what happened. Such memorials are very often subjected to this kind of horrible things. Look at somebody who painted a swastika on the statue of Shalom Alejand. They know he's Jewish, so isn't that a wonderful target for the swastika? Maybe it continues following the case of Menachem Mendel Beilis. Imagine, we are talking 20th century, and they blame a Jewish gentleman of a blood libel. They found the body of a young Christian boy, and they claimed that this man, Mendel Beilis, has killed him to use his blood to bake the matzah for Pesach. Can you imagine? The trial lasted forever. Everybody knew he was innocent, but it was a wonderful chance for the newspapers, for politicians, for statespeople, and so on, to blame him for that. In the meantime, it was a big, flourishing Jewish community for the longest time, and they had many, many synagogues. The great Choral Synagogue, that's what it looked like at the time. There was another Brodsky Synagogue, that's what it looks like nowadays. The interiors were redone over the last few years. I'd like to point out one of the houses that stands here, a house from the end of the 19th century, and a young lady was born in one of the upper floors of this building. I think you know her very, very well. After some of the pogroms that she has witnessed as a child, her earliest memories are from a pogrom that took place here, and the family moved to the United States. That's Golda Meir. That's where she was born, right here in the town of Kiev. We are going along the Kreshchatyk Street, which is the main street, almost a mile long, a very important street in downtown Kiev. And it was made famous a few years ago, if you remember, in 2004, when the Orange Revolution took place, where major changes took place in the government of Ukraine. We'll take a short ride. You see, we only go for about 20 minutes to a suburb of what is today a suburb of Kiev, but for us, it's something that will forever leave a mark in our memory. This is Babi Yar. You see, we drove just outside of Kiev, and this place is featured as a major, major killing place on the map of the disasters during the Holocaust. Unlike Poland and other countries where they took Jews by trains to the concentration camps, here they took them to nearby cemeteries or fields or forests, made them dig the ditches and shot them dead into that area. So here we have actually Jews being led to their death from Kiev. They had to walk this distance of a few miles to Babi Yar. And here we have these ditches with the tens of thousands of victims. Look how many of them in just a few days. Look at that. In 2 days, 33,771 Jews were shot dead into these pits of Babi Yar, and then another 15,000 over the next few months. I think many of you would be familiar with these pictures, and this is where these pictures were taken. It was here. You see, they made the people strip off their clothes before killing them so they can make use of their clothes. Who did it? And that's an important thing that we have to always remember. It was not the Nazis alone. They were aided by local collaborators almost everywhere they have acted. And sometimes the initiative was in the hands of the local fascists, the local anti-Semite, or whatever we call them. They could not possibly have done what they did without very generous help extended to them by the local collaborators. And they went, of course, looting. They went after the pillage. They went after the property that was left, the shops, the houses, the furniture, the jewelry, whatever they can put their hands on. And here we see after the war, we see them going through the leftover after all these people were killed and they started burying them. And here we have a very surprising event when Golda Meir shows up and she addresses the people at the memorial service at Babi Yar. We have a beautiful memorial there, but now they're building a new memorial. And I must admit that I'm not too happy with it. A few months ago, during COVID, they put the cornerstone for a new museum that will be built. Here we have the rendering of the museum. I admire the architecture and so on. What I don't like is they'd like to have people experiencing Babi Yar. So they're going to have, I hope they will not do it because I get very upset. They'd like to have some people dressed as the victims and some people dressed as Nazi officers to reenact these atrocities, to make it realistic. I mean, how sick can it be? Sorry if I'm being too personal, but that's something that I hope we'll all be able to fight and it should not happen. Otherwise, the building is going to be absolutely stunning. It's going to cost fortune. They're allocating for it and it will be a very important place to visit when one visits there. Usually, I would have driven to another location, not to go to this tiny little town of Malin. Malin is one of dozens and dozens, hundreds of small shtetls and communities with Jewish population, past and present. The reason I go there is because just a few months ago, yet another smashing of the headstones in the Jewish cemetery, and you see it happened so recently, and I think we should commemorate it and mention it, even though, to be honest with you, ever since there were dozens of such cases happening all over that part of the world. I mentioned Galicia, and as you see, the current day's border have nothing to do with the ethnic distribution, the languages spoken and so on. The country of Poland was moved to the left, was moved west after World War II. The country of Poland did not exist at all until the end of the World War I. For 123 years, Poland disappeared from the map of the world. Parts of it were incorporated into Russia, to the Tsar Empire, parts to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and parts to the Prussian Empire. So when Poland was founded, you see the location, and then after World War II, the whole country literally was moved. The eastern parts ended up in Belarus and Ukraine, and the western part was taking a bite from German territory. So Galicia, you see, lies at this area between Hungary, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ukraine, and Poland. From Malin, we'll continue driving on our way to Medjugorje. Now, that's a very important place. I've mentioned the fact that this place has been the birthplace of the Hasidic movement, a major shift in the way Jewish community lived. This amazing person, Rabbi Baal Shem Tov, which means the one who has a good name, he looked at the miserable conditions in which these people were living. They were struggling for a living, subjected to atrocities and persecutions and expulsions and pogroms and whatever. And he was going to bring a little of a joy, an element of different attitude into their livelihood. And that's how Hasidic movement was born. Baal Shem Tov is buried here. They are fixing, and they did a beautiful job on his tomb. They preserved the original tombstone dating back, as you can see, to 1760. A new headstone was erected there, as well as some more memorials to what happened, unfortunately, during the Holocaust. From here, we continue to another very important town in Jewish history, which is Gitomir. What I am surprised and amazed each time is that something most unusual we see in some of the cemeteries in this part of the world. I don't think you've ever seen anything like it. The tombstones are designed to look like boots. So when people will resurrect from the dead, they will already have their boots and they are facing Jerusalem, so they know which direction they should walk to go and meet Messiah. Look at the shoe, isn't that amazing? that this is how the tombstones were designed. Unfortunately, again, this is what the case was. The Jews were brought from town to the cemetery where they were shot. They are rebuilding now yet another synagogue. It will be a restoration of the beautiful synagogue that used to be here. Actually, they will enlarge it. They'll preserve the facade and add some more building to this, what is now not the greatest looking remain. For those of you who are familiar with Hebrew and Jewish literature, I believe many of you know the story of Chaim Nachman Bialik. Already during his lifetime in the 1930s, he was declared the national poet of. I'll unmute myself. I said that Bialik was chosen and was declared the national poet in the early 30s in Israel while he was still alive. So he was born in this town, but he moved all over Ukraine and Poland and Germany until he moved to Israel. The next place we go to is Berdychev, a major Hasidic center, and with a Jewish presence, as you see, that has lasted for many centuries. Unfortunately, not too many of the tombstones have survived, but look again at these boots. I must admit, I find it absolutely amazing to have all these tombstones designed as boots to show them the direction to walk to Jerusalem when they will resurrect. In the cemetery has the burial place of one of the greatest sages of the time, Levi Yitzchak of Berdychev, one of the most important Hasidic rabbis. Comes 1933, and Poland looks very different, as I said, than it looks now, or it didn't exist 13 years earlier, 14 years earlier. What I'd like to point out is that Vilnius, those of you who were with us the last time we visited, Vilnius was in Poland, whereas Kauna, was the capital of Lithuania. And same goes for these places. The towns we travel through, we're going to visit Rovno, Lvov, and so on, that today are in Ukraine. At that time, they were in Poland, the language was Polish, and we'll continue driving further on our way. We come to Rivne. Today they call it in Ukrainian. The Polish name was Rovno, and the Jews called it Rovno as well. Home to a very, very pious community, yet they were touched by the Zionist movement. They had youth movement, they had Zionist clubs, they participated in conventions. On one hand, very, very Orthodox community, and then Jewish education system, and Hashomer HaTzair, which is a youth movement, kind of a socialist, almost communist at the time, that were influenced by the new winds that blow through that part of the world. Unfortunately, during the Holocaust, 17,500 of the Jews of this town were killed, both by the Nazis and by the hands of the local fascist people. So we have, of course, the memorials, but that is not going to repair. You might have come across the name of this town if you read the book or maybe saw the movie, A Tale of Love and Darkness. Did any of you read the book or watch this movie? If not, try to see it. The book was written by one of the most outstanding Israeli writers, Amos Oz, whose family hails, his mother's side, hail from this town. His mother went to this school, imagine, where over 100 years ago, they taught everything in Hebrew. It was called Tarbut, which means culture. They taught math, history, chemistry, biology, physics, what have you. Everything was taught in Hebrew. Today, we can visit and walk around and see the place where the school was. This is Amos Oz with his parents, and that's his daughter, who is also an incredible accomplished writer and a professor in the university. They show here the graduation certificate of his mother from that Hebrew gymnasium, they called it. Not everybody was mean. Those of you who have been with me know that I like to point out wherever I can. Of course, we can dwell on it forever, but here is important to mention this German officer, a Nazi officer, who did his utmost to help save the Jews. He managed to convince his superiors that he needs the Jews for whatever public construction. Each time he would initiate and make up some baloney, some story, but that's how he was able to move them. And when he realized he cannot, he would take Jews in his car. He drove all night, 220 miles, back and forth for 3 days, each time in his private car to take Jews to safety. Try to get this book. An incredible story was told about him, the Moses of Rovno, an amazing, amazing officer, Grabe. We'll continue driving on our way to a town called Lvov. Today they call it Lviv. This town is 1 million citizens, 1 million residents, a very, very beautiful city with modern architecture, with historical structures, very colorful old city with medieval and 18th and 19th century buildings and churches and what have you, city square with fountains, and a memorial to the Polish writer Adam Mickiewicz, because remember, we are in Poland during that time. And the Polish presence almost vanished, except for the language spoken by some of the old-timers. Also here we have Hashomer Hatzair, these Jewish socialists, as we said, kind of youth movement, who were among the fighters later on in the ghettos, in the uprising, and among the founders of many communities, kibbutzim, and towns in Israel later on. It has today the most important university in Ukraine, but look at that. We are in 1937, a day without Jews. Already in 37, they demand that a ghetto will be set up for the Jews. There are no Germans here. They are the locals, the Ukrainians and the Poles, an anti-Jewish demonstration, and that was not the only case. And when the Nazis came, wow, now they have a free hand to abuse, to torture, to humiliate, to insult the Jews, to mock them, to cut the sidewalks, and to torture. If nothing else, look at this picture. This picture is haunting us. Look at the expression of fear on the face of this lady. They stripped her of her clothes, and they made her run through the streets, and the children were beating her up with wooden sticks. Imagine what the situation was like. And then, of course, they set up the ghetto, one of the largest ghettos in the ghetto network. 120,000 Jews were incarcerated into this ghetto. They tried to continue living as much as they could. Of course, the signs had to be put on all the Jewish business. This is Moses Estline or Mr. Bloom, so they have the Star of David, and everybody has to wear, you know, the armband with the Star of David, so everybody will know they're Jews. And here they take this old gentleman, they force him to be wrapped with the talit, with the prayer shawl, and he has to clean the streets, and then they made them kneel and clean the street with the toothbrush. Anything to humiliate, anything to break their spirit, not to mention, of course, the executions. People were hanged left and right. We have a very interesting memorial where the great synagogue used to be, and a few more memorials scattered through the town. The synagogue today, again, was totally reconstructed. It's home today to a few thousand Jews. The people who were taken to be killed were taken from Lvov to the nearby concentration camp of Yanovska. The place was surrounded with the fence, as we have seen in many other places, with the barbed fences and what have you. The Jews were kept there as a labor force. They would be marched to the places where they would be employed. And in order to assist the Germans to count them as they were walking, as the Germans have done in other places, they set up orchestras. And the orchestras would play so people will march to the rhythm, whether you want it or not. When you hear the music playing in a certain rhythm, You march along, and that's how they were able to count them, way in and way out. Can you imagine? An orchestra for that purpose. Himmler visited Janowska because Janowska did something that I don't know you have seen in many other places. Look at that. Bone crushing machine. After they've killed the thousands of people in an attempt to hide any evidence of their heinous crimes, they took some other Jews, had them exhume the bodies. Some of them were burned, but the bones remained. So now they are using this bone crushing machine. Can you just imagine the number of people we think were killed in Janowska? Anywhere from 35 to 40,000 people, Jews that is, which are part of the 100 or 120,000 people that were killed in the area. The others from this town and from other communities around were sent to a nearby death camp. You know, concentration camps were all over the place. They killed all over the place, but death camps, factories of death, unfortunately, were only built on Polish soil, not by the Poles, no, but they were only in Poland. That is Berdychev, Chełmno, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek, and the nearest one was here in Berdychev. Please look at the telegram and look at the figures. The Germans confirm in an original telegram that 434,508 Jews were killed in this camp. What we know now, we estimate the number at 600,000. And what is the most shocking, look at the short period of time it operated and how many people read it. 30 SS men. How could 30 people exterminate 600,000 people? Very easily. Look what they did. A devilish, a brilliant idea. The train stopped and people are unloaded into what was called a sluice. You see, it's like a narrow corridor with high walls on both sides, and that corridor led straight to the gas chambers. It was so efficient. It was like an industrial, systematic annihilation. We have them now, of course, memorials for them all over the place. And another righteous person I have to mention, even though Yad Vashem in Israel did not recognize him as such. He was a clergyman. When the Germans, he welcomed them because they were better for him than the Soviets. The Soviets didn't want any church, any religious, anything. So he welcomed the Germans. In the meantime, he was a Philo-Semite. He helped smuggle and he convinced lots of other clergy to hide Jews. And thousands of people were saved because of his effort. Some of us call him sometime the Ukrainian Schindler, a high-ranking clergyman, an amazing person. You might have seen the movie about this town, In Darkness. Did you see this movie? Based on a true story. This guy, Socha, Leopold Socha, he worked for the sanitary system. He worked for the town. He was in charge of the sewage. And he discovered Jews hiding there, and they would bribe him so he can bring them food and candles and batteries for their lanterns. Until one day they told him, sorry, we have no money. Now you are gonna probably turn us in. And guess what happened? Between him and his wife, they made every effort in the book, and they continued feeding all these people hiding in the sewage. They didn't see the day of light for the longest months. And he helped save them. Unfortunately, he was killed in a stupid car accident right after the war, so we never had the chance to thank him properly. But try to watch this movie if you didn't watch it yet. It's an incredible movie, In Darkness. So the country has gone through many changes. They had this junta, the Banderist junta. The Soviets, of course, will demolish the memorials. And again, the Jews within themselves have a very interesting story. You can read about this gentleman, Rabbi Abraham Cohn. He came from Bohemia. but he was too advanced, too sophisticated for the very conservative and traditional Jewish community. A very strange story. Now, as they work in the city and they fix the street and they fix the sidewalks, they remove the dirt and the pavement. And what do they see? That big parts of the street were paved with Jewish tombstones. They already found it's readily available building material to use in a secondary use, face down. The inscription faces down, and when people walk on it, nobody knows. They're actually walking on a huge Jewish cemetery. People discover it in their courtyards. They discover it in their farms. A big, big project that is led, imagine, by a young French Catholic priest. He took it upon himself, and he goes and he helps and he digs and he brings them to be properly positioned in a Jewish cemetery. On many of the buildings, we have lots and lots of Hebrew and Yiddish Jewish inscription describing the stores, and in some of the buildings that used to be synagogues, you can see the Star of David and other elements that tell us the story. We continue driving to Drovovitz. Drovovitz today is a smaller town, but still very impressive, beautiful synagogue that was redone. When you see such a synagogue, you must imagine that was a very affluent Jewish community, or else they couldn't possibly afford to build these magnificent buildings. It was home to some of the most outstanding personalities in the world of Jewish culture. Ephraim Lillian, an incredible accomplished painter. The ghetto that was set up here is decorated by bits and pieces of art that was created by Jewish people. One of the most famous writers, Bruno Schulz, he was a writer and a painter, and you can see his date. At a very young age, he was killed during the Holocaust. Luckily, in one building, dozens of his beautiful aquarelles, beautiful paintings he left on the walls have remained. Maybe one of the greatest of them all, Maurizio Gottlieb. Imagine, he died when he was 23. He left behind 300 outstanding masterpieces. His last painting was the synagogue in Yom Kippur, where he is featured here, actually 3 times. He painted himself 3 times, like a prophetic thing. Shortly afterwards, he passed away. He took a very bad flu, and he passed away at 23. We continue to Berdychev, they call it today, and this place became very famous. I don't know if you came across this book. Daniel Mendelssohn went on a search of his family roots, and he toured extensively, and he found a lot in this town, in archives and stories and testimonies, and he published this amazing book, The Lost. Again, the city would have the typical public buildings. The one from the Soviet time are not so heavily represented, but the ones from the Tsar Empire, and of course, the synagogue that still survives. From Berdychev, we continue on our way to Buchach. Buchach, for us in Israel, is the most significant place, other than the Jewish story and the community and the synagogues and so on. It is the birthplace of Shai Agnon, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, the first Israeli to have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, one of the most outstanding writers who created a very unique style. Nobody continued. So we even have a street named after him. You see the street is using Cyrillic writing because it was done during the Soviet time. But the synagogue here has the tombs of his parents and relatives. So it's something that we follow and monitor very, very closely. We continue after this place on our way to Chernovitz. Now we go to a different realm. Today it's Ukraine, but originally many of these places I mentioned, the borders changed. I'll show you some maps later on. We're going into what was for the longest time Romania, and the language spoken was Romanian. A beautiful little town, again, some beautiful frescoes and stuccos on the walls of the old town, beautiful architecture. magnificent decorated houses, the public buildings, the pedestrian streets, and the churches with great 20th century modern architecture, and of course the Jewish presence in this town. Here we have a picture of the synagogue from before the war, of course, from Chernovitz. Still, we can visit and stand. Some of the pictures you could have seen me as I walk around with people visiting these places, tracing our Jewish heritage in many of these towns. I'd like to point out one building in particular. I don't know if you've ever seen anything like it. You know, they were not very rich, and they wanted to build a sukkah for the Feast of Tabernacles. They might not have the place or the money. Look what they did. The partex leading into the house would have an opening roof. So during 1 week every year, they would remove these plates. They will open it up so you should be able to see the stars. That's what makes it a sukkah. Isn't that interesting that they could open this part of the house to use it during the week of Tabernacles? Chernovich, again, home to a very prominent, very busy, very active Jewish community. And I think you can learn, again, when I mention affluent, of course, we respect and we love everybody, poor and rich. But when you see some of these tombstones, my goodness, they have cost fortune. They had to employ artisans and craftsmen to create this kind of monumental burial estates. They had like crypts and they had like family tombs and so on and so on. And it has a very interesting museum. You see that it talks about Bukovinian Jews, not Ukrainian Jews, because Bukovina is part of Romania. And that was the story for many, many centuries. And then, of course, we continue to look at some of the Jewish places, and we talk about Jewish literary and significant people. This poet, Itzik Manger, he was one of the fantastic authors. He wrote in Yiddish as well, and his very famous play, the Megillah Songs, is played until today. Some great other personalities like Paul Celan, Eliezer Steinberg. Steinberg is commemorated even in town because the town people regard him as an outstanding personality in the history of this town. We're going to go now to Kaminsk Podosk. This place is connected not only with Ukraine, but with the deportation of thousands of Jews from Hungary before the Nazis started sending Jews to their death. Jews who didn't have Hungarian citizenship were rounded up in Budapest, put on the train to take the trip to Kaminsk Podosk, where they were killed. The Holocaust didn't actually start yet, imagine. Today, it's a beautiful town. The castle dominates the skyline. It's a very impressive medieval castle. And it was home to yet another disaster, Jacob Frank. Centuries after Shabtai Tzvi, we had another false messiah. Again, people disillusioned, people frightened, people desperate followed him, and that was another calamity we suffered, Jacob Frank, another false messiah. Another great writer that hails from this place is Mendele Mocher Sfarim. Mocher Sfarim means the one who sells the books. If you walk with me now in Israel, actually we'll be walking through this program because all of these people have streets named after them, schools, squares, memorials, very significant writer. And in modern time, one of the greatest chess players, Leonid Stein, a Jew who hails from this area, one of the greatest pianists of our time, 21st century, Mikhail Alperin, also hails from Kaminsk Podosk. We continue to the town of Vinnitsa, one of the most picturesque, most colorful towns in this area. And luckily, we have a few pictures showing us Jewish life in the shtetls, in these towns. They lived in like big farms. They were very closely knit communities. But then fame comes from this picture. I don't know if you've ever seen it. This picture became a token. This is a picture that is featured each time we talk about the systematic annihilation. The Germans took this picture, the last Jew of Vinnitsa. Everybody else was shot into the pits. He is the last one, and they made the point of taking the picture so the commandant can report back to the headquarters, no more Jews in Vinnitsa. You might have seen this picture because it's featured in lots of publications and exhibitions. Nowadays, we have the Chabad who set shop in many places. Signs are being put up, memorials are being put up. Not far from here, there was a resort, a vacation home for Hitler. They were building a place for him deep here into the east when he was dreaming about extending the power. Remember, the war is going on in Stalingrad, and they built a beautiful resort with a swimming pool. Nothing exists nowadays. Jewish partisans joined the people here and fought with them against the Germans. We have now another trip. We go to Nemiriv, they call it today in Ukrainian. And this is the place to mention some of the righteous among the nations. We have here the survivor and all of his offspring standing next to the sign in Yad Vashem, commemorating this amazing person, Adam Frida, who helped save him and the life of his family. The end of our trip, our bus trip, if you wish, that we take around Ukraine will bring us to the most beautiful city of them all, that is Odessa, built on the shores of the Black Sea. It's a seaside resort with culture, with opera, with theaters, with libraries, magnificent buildings, most gorgeous palaces and palatial mansions. The office buildings were built to really look like palaces, and a walk through this town and along the beach is really remarkable with the squares and the art. Beautiful, beautiful arcades. Look at the amount of statues decorating this indoor arcade. And it's not only home to Jewish culture, but people you would know like Pushkin. Pushkin comes from this town, from Odessa, and that's where he would meet with lots of other literary, like Nikolai Gogol, the writer and playwright. Tchaikovsky, the musician, operated here. So this city has seen so much culture. It was featured in this very famous movie you might have seen, The Battleship Potemkin, the movie that was directed by the Jewish director, Sergei Eisenstein. You might remember the boots stepping down on the steps, and maybe the most shocking scene was the baby stroller going down, down, down the stairs, and the expression of fear on the face of the baby. So this city has lots of interesting sights to see. Not least are huge caverns, big cavities under the city, like catacombs, which were for the longest time stone quarries, limestone quarries to build the city. The marketplaces are unique in Europe. They feature lots and lots of fish that is captured and fished in the Black Sea. Very unusual looking and very delicious ones that are being sold here in this town, like the turbo and other fish. And it is home to occasional musical performances and cultural performances right in the heart of the market. Jewish presence, of course, there were quite a few synagogues. Now they set up shop. We have kosher restaurants. It was home to the gathering of the literary. All of the greatest of them all would gather here. Bialik, whom we met earlier, he met here with Ravnitsky. The two of them put together one of the most important books, a resource center for Jewish legends. Ahad Ha'am, who was an essayist, a Zionist, a philosopher, who put together some of the most important composition. Lilienblum, again, it looked like we're walking in the streets of Tel Aviv. Jabotinsky, the revisionist, the inspiration for the Irgun, for Menachem Begin and the Herut Party, subsequently Likud. And a very, very special intellectual, Joseph Klausner, the great uncle of Amos Oz. He made it to Israel with lots of these dignitaries on an incredible coincidence. This was Ruslan. Ruslan, you can compare it maybe to the Mayflower, where on one ship we had some of the greatest poets and writers and painters and Zionist leaders and so on. Unfortunately, the ones who remained there were subjected to this massacre, the famous Odessa Massacre, which is commemorated here on the train station in town and a few other memorials through town. I mentioned different countries, so please look where we are. Odessa, at the time of the war, was Romania. Remember, I mentioned we are in Transnistria. Everybody knows about Auschwitz and Birkenau and the plight of the Jews from Poland, and we learn about Latvia and Lithuania and so on. Now we know Ukraine. Very few people are aware of the fact that almost 300,000 Romanian Jews were sent to camps in Transnistria. We call them the forgotten camps. This is the area which we are talking about. Today, it's another country. Today, they established a separate independent country, which is Moldova. It is landlocked, but at the time, Transnistria has reached the sea. You see, Odessa is part of Transnistria. It was this person, despicable person, along with a group of very radical fascists who organized the deportation of Jews and the killing of tens of thousands of Jews without a single German present. They did it themselves. Tens of thousands were killed by the Romanian fascists. Look it up, please. You will not believe what you'll read. Somehow it didn't make... I saw that you had a walk in Arad a few days ago. Was it mentioned? Sorry, I didn't have a chance to see it. So that is such a sad story, and unfortunately not too much is talked about. So you see Transnistria, which was Romania, now the borders have changed, and now it is the area of Moldova. Our official tour is over, but I cannot I must take you to see something that happens nowadays. We come to the town of Uman. Uman is the burial place of a famous rabbi, a great Hasidic rabbi, who was a little strange. I don't know if he was on substance or he was just, very spiritual or whatever. He didn't have children and he died and nobody continued. But his tomb is a pilgrimage site to tens of thousands of people who come there now, even as we speak, to come to the tomb. All dressed in white. They have special ceremonies. They go to the waterfront. They walk around in the streets. They create some unbelievable ceremonies. This is Uman, especially tens of thousands of them go there for Rosh Hashanah. They think it's a special thing to be there. They'll get a special blessing. It's like an omen. It's a special virtue to spend time there during Rosh Hashanah, and they fill the streets of Uman. On the driving to the other direction, I'd like to take you to the Crimean Peninsula. You know the Crimean Peninsula is the place of Yalta. Yalta was the city you see where Roosevelt made with Churchill and Stalin during the war, a meeting that really changed the course of World War II. But I brought you here to talk about a very interesting group. Those of you who were with us last time we met, I mentioned the Karaites. They are a very interesting sect of Jewish origin, and they were situated in large numbers here. At one point, they encompassed big chunks of the Jewish world in the southern part of Europe. Now there are very few of them, but they had their town built up on top of the cliffs in Simferopol. You really have to climb hard. I'm very happy I did it when I was a bit younger. And you go and see their dwelling places and their synagogues with Hebrew inscription. The letters are Hebrew, but the language is a Turkic language. It's not Hebrew language. A very interesting group, the Karaite Jews, so a big center for them here in the area of Simferopol on the Crimean Peninsula. Wow, I managed to keep it to an hour.
You did. You kept it to exactly an hour because I think we started 2 minutes early. So that was perfectly an hour. Thank you so much. That was incredible. And there's wonderful comments as usual about your tours. And we're so grateful that we did this tour. I think I learned more than an hour I think I learned more in an hour in your tours than I ever did in any history class that I've ever taken in any school that I ever attended. So thank you so much for doing this. I think that every person deserves to see this tour. So to answer everybody's question that asked me, yes, we will send the recording. The recording is actually already live on YouTube. So you can click on some of the links that I've been posting for YouTube. You can feel free to view that actually again right after the program. And I will be sending an email to everybody who's in this group right now with the materials so you can click on the links that Jacob had in his slides and do a lot more research and a lot more reading and so on and so forth. So we will be sending that out in the next little bit. So we do have a lot of questions. I don't know if we'll be able to cover all of them with the time that we have, but I will go through some of them. Someone was asking their grandparents and their father was born in Satnov, south of Kiev. Does that town still exist?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. Let me just keep, oops. Computer's frozen here. Let me see what else. There's so many comments. What was the efforts that were made to fight anti-Semitism? And this is kind of a twofold question, like anti-Semitism now and efforts that were made to fight anti-Semitism in Ukraine in the 20th, in the 20th and the 21st centuries.
My goodness, that's the gazillion-dollar question. There was a previous question earlier. Somebody asked, is there anti-Semitism in Ukraine today?
Exactly, yes, yeah. So we can cover, yeah.
Big time, big time. We are doing our best, but again, I am the most optimistic person personally, but when it comes to that, I don't want to say I'm giving up, but I say sometimes we fight a almost lost battle. It has to do, in my view, it has to do with education. And I always say, whenever the subject comes up, I will inscribe it on the walls of every politician, of every statesman, of every person in charge of the budget. You think education is expensive? Try ignorance. And I think that's what causes it. It's the ignorance. And if we would make sure that people will be educated, that we will be able to install common sense and such notions as tolerance and respect, and to be able to contain and to accommodate the other, the different, to be respectful of the others and so on. Unfortunately, that is not a priority. And the result we see. I mean, unfortunately, I must admit, we just got out of, a few weeks ago, we got out of our shelters when we were getting all these missiles and rockets flying at us. One of them landed 700 yards from where I live in Tel Aviv. I must say that I'm worried a lot about what's going on in the United States nowadays. Like here I am out of the shelter and I'm worried about you guys. So I think, and it's the same story. It has to do with education.
Yeah, and I was going to say, it's really the same thing here. We do lack a lot of education, Holocaust education. And so, yeah, we should be worried about what's going on in the United States just as much as what's going on in the Ukraine and in Europe in general. Are there genealogical documents available from 100 plus years ago?
Oh, yes, they are. I'd like to suggest you visit with Jewish Gen. Jewish Gen is a fantastic source of information in genealogy. to find documents from the archives. They went all over, they digitized, they computerized, and it can be accessed. Another story, another wonderful place to visit is shtetl.org. That deals with the shtetls, like you were asking about this town or another, but also within the shtetl, they have a fantastic database of the families, the people who live there, the trades, professions, business transactions, and so on and so on. So Jewish Gen and shtetl, two wonderful sites to visit.
Great. What, if any, is the relationship between the name of this Galatia and the Galatia in Northwest Spain?
Nothing,
Same name?
nothing,
Why?
nothing.
Okay.
Nothing. Galicia in Northwest Spain is another remarkable place. I wish I could take you on a tour there. The Santiago de Compostela, a fantastic pilgrimage site of St. John. But other than that, no relations, no relations.
Who is doing the restoration and rebuilding of Jewish synagogues?
Yeah, so mostly it is initiated and carried out by the Chabad representatives with lots and lots of local and foreign Jewish billionaires who left the Soviet Union, or what became of the Soviet Union when Russia was declared. Many of them amassed incredible fortune in the immediate years following the demise of the Soviet empire of evil, and they contribute a lot. Chabad itself is being supported almost single-handedly by one gentleman, a Jew from Uzbekistan, from Bukhara, Lev Levayev, who has been for over 20 years supporting all of the Chabad Lubavitch activity in the big realm of the former Soviet Union, Russia and the neighboring countries.
Great. I think a couple of people were asking about the books and the movies that you mentioned, but that's all going to be in the slides that you send, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So we can talk about that. Did Ukraine fight on the side of the Germans or the Soviets?
So many of them were in the Soviet army, but some people who didn't care much for the Soviets collaborated with the Germans, not only because of anti-Semitism, but because by now they were not very happy. By now they've been subjected to the Soviet rule for a few decades, and they didn't care much for it.
Great. Why were death camps only built in Poland?
$1 million question. We don't know that they intended to do it, but somehow between the network of trains that could bring people from all over the continent to Poland and the ability to set shop there, Poland was next door to Germany. So they would treat Germany as the hinterland. That was the backyard. That was supposed to be the breadbasket. And that's where they would set up factories and employ cheap labor. Apparently, eventually it was slave labor for the various industries. So the reason they didn't have them in Russia is partly because the gauge of the railway was different. When the Russian Tsar constructs the railroads in the late 19th century and the other ones continued in the early 20th century, they always feared an invasion of the Prussians. There is no Germany at the time, the Prussians, 19th century. So fearing the invasion, they made sure to build the railroads on a different gauge. So the cars and the engines could not drive through Russia. And that's why the Germans set up what we call the Einsatzgruppen, the death squads, who went into the Jewish places and killed the Jews in situ. Very few Jews from that area were taken to concentration or death camps unless they were taken to be used in the labor camps before they were being killed. And I have to agree with the gentleman who wrote here, I forgot the name. You mentioned something which is very important, and I agree with you. Oh, Philip Gordon. Thank you, Philip Gordon, for your comment. People are killed in an automobile accident. Jews in Ukraine were murdered, and we have to make sure to use the proper term. And I thank you very much, Philip, for bringing it up. Thank you so much.
Yes, I didn't see, that must have gone straight to you. I think where are centers of real where are centers of real Jewish life today, not just memorials?
Oh, in all of these places, definitely in Kiev, definitely in Lvov, in Odessa, in many, many of these towns, there is a viable Jewish community. Yes.
Okay, great. I see just a lot of really good comments, and I'm just gonna send you all the comments. So there's just a lot of great comments. I do want to talk about, because our time is coming up, I want to share with everybody that's left on the call, and while we have Jacob on the call, that of course we have another tour coming up on Tuesday, which is going to be great at 11 a.m., but not with Jacob, with another wonderful tour guide. But coming up on the 21st is going to be our what I guess we will call our season finale. Adi and I just thought that would be cute because we're cute. So it's going to be our season finale, and we're going to do it with Jacob because we're so fond of him and his work. And it's going to be a 5-day virtual tour to Israel. So instead of giving you one day on Tuesday, we're going to do 5 days in Israel and really tour Israel, like get actually on a bus, but really virtually on a virtual bus to Israel for 5 days, and have Jacob actually take us around as he would take around an actual group of people, really to different sites. And every day we'll really be delving into different societies, different places in Israel. And me and Adi had a little taste of it yesterday. And even though Adi is, from Israel and lives there, and I grew up in Israel, we really got to see places that I've definitely haven't been to in a very long time, or really never. And even Adi had some places that she'd never been to. So we're really excited about it. It's going to be June 21st through June 25th. The capacity is going to be limited registration. So we're really excited. We're going to send out the first email about it on Sunday for registration. So please be on the lookout for that. Jacob, do you want to say anything about the tour that you're going to be taking us on?
Sure. Until we have a chance to travel together for real, at least that will be some kind of a wonderful way to be able to visit lots of new places. Even those of you who have been to Israel, even recently, I'd like to introduce new places and put in context some of the old historical, archaeological, current affairs, economy, agriculture in the desert, water, and lots of the most fantastic discoveries of our startup nation.
Yes, we're very excited. It's going to be our last one. We're doing it for 5 days, and on Friday night, we're even going to get together for a little Kabbalat Shabbat together with Jacob and us in a discussion. And we will send you more information about it this Sunday. Please be on the lookout for us. We hope you'll be able to join us. Other than that, thank you for being here. Thank you for all your support, your donations, for helping us to make this season possible. Have a great Tuesday, and we hope to see you next Tuesday. And we definitely hope to see you with us in Israel on the week of the 21st of June. Thank you, Jacob, for being here, for all your wonderful information, guidance, and just brilliance in the touring world. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Shalom, everybody. Shalom. Lehitraot.
Thank you. Lehitraot. Toda raba.
Toda, Jacob. Bye-bye.
Bye. Toda.